Gentlemen, as I said in the last lecture, we're going to enter into the history of the problem of freedom. I also announced that this history, if we consider the origins of the problem, is the history of the idea of necessity much more than the idea of freedom. Before we consider, and we can do this only very briefly, before we consider the idea of necessity among the philosophers properly speaking, it's perhaps worthwhile to study the more popular idea of necessity among the ancients. The belief in fate was a very widespread belief, generally widespread throughout all of antiquity. It's still a belief in necessity. It's not entirely the belief I'll analyze in the next lecture, the belief that has its roots in the intellect that comes from our reflective thought. The belief in that kind of necessity looks for laws that unfold in time. That, gentlemen, is necessity as the philosopher conceives it. But there's a belief in necessity whose origins aren't intellectual, aren't rational, but affective. And I might say emotional. This belief seems to be the ancient, popular belief in destiny and fate. I don't know whether anyone has ever undertaken a deep scientific study of the origins of the idea or even of its evolution across classical antiquity. This would be a study of great interest, though, since few ideas played as considerable a role in antiquity as this one did. The ideas of the ancients on this subject, it must be said, are quite vague, as happens with ideas that have a rather emotional origin. The belief in fate, moreover, must really be older than classical antiquity. However, in classical antiquity, the idea is still very vague. Defined in a general way, this belief is a belief in a blind force, rather more evil than good, that governs human affairs, that determines events in general, and even our decisions, insofar as they are made within the web of events. In the ancient poets, this force appears to be omnipotent, even more powerful than the gods. The gods are subject to fate. We could cite several ancient texts. Here's a dialogue between the chorus and Prometheus in Aeschylus's Prometheus. Chorus: well, who is the steersman of necessity? That is, the force that directs necessity. Prometheus: the triple fates and the unforgetting furies. Chorus: you mean Zeus is less strong than these? Prometheus: certainly he cannot escape destiny. We find nearly the exact same words in Herodotus' Persian Wars. None may escape his destined lot, not even a god. On this point, the question of knowing whether it's necessary that the gods themselves be subject to fate, the view of the ancients isn't settled. In the poets, and in particular in Homer, we discover passages both for and against this view. There are quite a few passages in favor of the gods being subject to fate, but there are some against, which are fairly typical. I'll just quote the passage from Book 16 of the Iliad, in which Jupiter, or rather Zeus, states that fate wants that Serpendon be killed by Patroclus. Will he let this happen? He hesitates. Juno, or rather Hera, intervenes and asks him to let it happen. Nevertheless, she recognizes that Zeus has the power, if he wants, to send Serpendon back to Lycia unscathed, delivered, or rather dispensed from death, from ill-sounding death. There are even one or two passages in Homer where the poet goes further. In certain cases, it seems, he attributes to humans themselves the power to evade what fate has decreed. Thus, still in Book 16, we see Patroclus chased after the Trojans and the Lycians. And then we have those two lines, besotted, had he only kept the command of Pelides, he might have got clear away from the evil spirit of Black Death. Thus, gentlemen, popular thought, like the poets express, is rather uncertain on this point, as is, for that matter, the genealogy of this divinity superior to all others. Certain authors make the goddess of fate, Destiny, the daughter of Zeus himself. Others make her the daughter of Kronos. Still others, the daughter of the ocean. There's one point, however, on which all of them agree. They all make Destiny the daughter of the night. There is a passage in Plato's Republic where he says something analogous. For Plato, fate is the daughter of Enanke, of necessity. And in Plato's system, necessity is the principle opposed to the good, which is, as you know, the light, the sun. For this reason, too, fate is the daughter of the night, the principle of obscurity. The thought of the ancients in itself is thus very imprecise. What are its origins? It's very hard to say. If what we're trying to determine is the accidental historical origins, we don't currently have the documents. As you know, right now, some people are engaged in a scholarly investigation into the historical, or rather the prehistorical origins of certain very profound beliefs, like the belief in fate. They put forward a thesis which, incidentally, we'll have to criticize, the thesis that a lot of these beliefs can be explained by causes that are entirely accidental, and parallel by the association of ideas that point to a very inferior mentality like the one we find today in certain primitive tribes, which are in a state, of stupefaction in the face of the things around them. We mustn't disdain an explanation of this kind, but when the issue is a belief as profound and as widespread as fate, we can't imagine that the origins are profound as well, the psychological origins. In fact, when we turn to psychological analysis, we come upon a certain number of elements. There's not just one cause, not one reason for this belief in fate. There are a lot of them. First in line, we'd have to put what I call the ineluctability of death. The idea of death must have played a major role here, or rather, humanity's feeling in relation to death. In fact, we should note that the characteristic that classical antiquity attributes to fate are the very characteristics of death. Death is inevitable. Among all human events, it is the only one whose inevitability is beyond doubt. It is therefore absolutely inevitable. It's unforeseeable. While we know that we must die, we generally never know when. We don't know when or how. So death is a simultaneously unforeseeable and inevitable event. And then it's an event that seems to take no kind of human scheming into account. An event that takes place independently of every kind of human event. In this sense, death might strike at any time. It might strike when a great enterprise that could be useful to humanity is about to be completed, or it might happen before, as in Balzac's novel, The Search for the Absolute, when the main character dies at the very moment that he's going to disclose the secret of nature, the secret of the philosopher's stone. So there's an event that takes place as if it had been marked out independently of anything we might think of as human considerations. It's a thread that is cut at a given moment because it was necessary that it be cut at that exact moment. The three essential characteristics of death are precisely the three characteristics of fate in general, such as the ancients pictured it. It is implacable. Destiny is inevitable. We cannot know it. It's unforeseeable. Finally, it takes nothing into account. Fate is blind. On top of that, we should note, and this is a telltale sign, we should note that the Greek words to designate the goddess of death, the Parsiai, the Moirai, the Caries, are the very words that in the singular designate fate and in the plural death. Indeed, destiny is called Moira, care. So, it's the same words, and it's likely that basically it's the same thing. Death, then, is what first inspired this feeling, or rather this emotional idea. It then is probable that the idea of the fatality of death, so to speak, radiated, opened up into all the rest of existence. It reascended the entire slope of life, and the characteristics of the outcome reflected little by little into the entire drama comedy. This is how, after having been perhaps only the idea limited to the final event, the idea of fate was extended to life as a whole. So there's that origin, but undoubtedly, as I was telling you, there are many others. Right here, while explicating Alexander of Aphrodisias on fate, I happened to discuss his opinion, which isn't lacking in subtlety, that in general we attribute our successes to ourselves, but the lack of success, the failures, we like better to attribute to a foreign force. We believe in forces antagonistic to ours. What are these factors? First of all, there are wills, undoubtedly human wills that are opposed to our will, but there are also forces of nature that are opposed to our force. But there is, moreover, something like the encounter or the combination of all of these elements together. This combination occurs in a given place at a given moment, and it's this combination that is truly efficacious. Because if these elements hadn't met where they had met and hadn't met when they met, what happened probably wouldn't have happened. Well, this coincidence, this encounter, is something unforeseeable in general, and something that constitutes what we've always called chance. The ancients, touche, luck, is something unforeseeable, irrational, and unreasonable. Let me note in passing that we've always sought to conjure chance by means of irrational, non-reasonable practices. The magic we find in all ancient religions is nothing other than this set of irrational practices intended to conjure the irrational force that is chance. The idea of chance forms rather naturally from all this, and then especially from the conviction that humanity is not entirely the cause of its failures and lacks of success. And then logic is brought to bear on this originally rather emotional idea. The demarcation line between success and lack of success is very difficult to draw. That is, the limit between what is beneficial and what is not beneficial. And thus, the idea of fate, which at first was limited to characterizing the collection of obstacles placed in the way of human activity, could be extended, and it ended up engulfing not only what goes against our activities, but even what in turn benefits this activity. At that point, our actions themselves, all of the ways of getting things done, becomes effects of fate, movements intended to lead to and facilitate the event marked out by destiny. In short, it's what I was saying earlier, an unfavorable event or a series of unforeseeable, unfavorable events suggest the idea, and the idea radiates, opens up, and little by little reaches a very large number of events to which it did not first apply. Gentlemen, it's likely that this idea wouldn't have had much credence in antiquity, that the conviction, the belief in fate, wouldn't have been so widespread if it hadn't had even deeper emotional roots. All in all, a belief in general and its tenacity can be explained only if it is compatible with humanity. If the belief in fate didn't contain something compatible with us, we likely wouldn't accept it so easily. It's clear that the belief in destiny is a belief that has something consoling in it. From the moment that humanity is endowed with memory, from the moment that it is endowed with foresight, two attributes that distinguish it from animal, humanity's joy and pains are infinitely multiplied. That's often been said. Joy is multiplied by expectation and also by memory. It is multiplied by expectation because hope always presents us the future in a beneficial light. Even if hope doesn't make things more beautiful, it multiplies. We imagine many possible futures, all of which might be happy, when only one among them will be realized. In regard to the recollection of the past, people have often spoken of the poetry in memory. Memory makes things more beautiful. We might even wonder, this is another question, whether the idea of happiness does not come, to a large extent, from the faculty of foresight, from the faculty of remembering, whether the complete idea of happiness is only ever realized in the future or in the past. Even when sorrow and sadness are at issue, foresight and regret, or rather, memory, are still forces of multiplication, multiplying forces. Everyone says this is a banal truth that a misfortune happening is still better than a misfortune feared. When the misfortune is upon us and we feel its blow, we feel less anxiety than when we don't know where the blow is going to land and where to ward it off. When what's at issue is the past, there's no pain more harrowing than the regret, in many cases, of realizing that simply doing something different from what we did would have sufficed for something different to happen from what did happen. The belief in fate is a consoling belief because it's the very simple reason that we no longer have to be concerned about the future. It's marked out in advance, so there's no uncertainty, and there's no reason to regret the past, because no matter what we did, what did happen would have happened. It's a very consoling belief, this. Moreover, we see in antiquity that it forms the leitmotif, so to speak, of all the consolations. For the consolation was a literary genre in antiquity. Consolations were treatises or letters a philosopher sent to someone who had suffered a severe misfortune. We know that this genre flourished especially during the Stoic period, that is, among people who were convinced of universal determinism. Their argument par excellence was the argument from fate. The belief in fate is a belief that must arise naturally and as if spontaneously in beings like humans who are emotional, who have foresight of the future, and at the same time, memory of the past. Today, we would say that it's an antidote, an antitoxin. Today, we are told that bacteria are generated in the organism, that they produce poisons or toxins. Then, by means of its natural force of defense, the organism produces antitoxins. That is, it secretes substances intended to neutralize the damage that the other substances have produced. Let's take an animal soul and let's make it human by introducing into it memory and the foresight that we find in humans will produce suffering and mental illness, or as the ancient moralists said, anxiety and regret. Then, by itself, the moral organism is going to react and secrete some sort of antitoxin, and its ultimate reaction against suffering will be the belief in fate. This reason explains the belief in fate quite naturally. We'd find many others if we had the time to develop this analysis further. We'd find other emotional causes. This would perhaps be more subtle. We could discover reasons coming from self-love, since one must always look for it as a reason not only for human actions, but also for human beliefs. It's the great motivation and one of the great sources of beliefs, a lot more than interest, regardless of what philosophers have said about this. When they present humanity, perhaps we'll be able to return to this later in relation to the different kinds of determinism. When they present humanity to us as determined by its interests. And this is the case with utilitarian ethics. They exaggerate the value of this motivation. Very often, this is a motive we put at the top of the list. We prefer confessing to a motive like this one, even though, at bottom, self-interest is less admissible morally. We prefer confessing to this motive to confessing to pride, but pride or self-love is the main motive. At first sight, though, this belief certainly seems to testify to a certain feeling of humility. It's indeed a force that goes beyond the human. It would thus be an expression of its modesty. But looking at it more closely, we see that in this belief in fate, there's something that raises us up, that encourages our pride, because we feel that we are in league with this superhuman force that governs everything. While we suffer its effects, we also participate in it. Our actions, our entire life, thus lose their contingency, their accidental character. It pains us to admit that a small change in circumstances would have been enough for us not to have been born, for our existence not to have come about, that the slightest thing would have been enough for such and such an act, which may have decided our existence not to have come about. The belief in fate immediately gives our actions and our situations an importance they perhaps wouldn't have had without it, as if they were so many cosmic events. Human actions, situations take on the same importance as cosmic events. There is thus at the bottom of this belief a point of pride that we end up untangling all the same. In all of this, there's a lot of other things yet. I'm not insisting on all the elements, emotional as well, that we'll find in this idea. I've insisted on this as much as I have because the idea of fate is even more alive than we think. When we speak of fate, we like to say that it's an ancient idea, that it's part of paganism. Paganism is gone, but the idea remains. A lot less visible, no doubt, a lot less explicit, latent, deep in souls, and in a state of torpor. But it surfaces at certain times, especially in circumstances that are serious. And then, among the very people who reject it, where the events of individual lives are concerned, we find this idea to be as alive, as intense as ever, when it comes to no longer individual events, but collective events and actions. We no longer believe in fate concerning the individual, but we believe in fate as soon as what's at issue are peoples. The story of sociology is that of the old fatalism in general. There are exceptions, but at its core, it's fatalism. What reasons are given for this determinism in the history of peoples? We're going to have to concern ourselves with this question over the course of this study. But I'll say right away that historical determinism, historical fatalism generally, reasons as if it were up to those who believe in the contingency of historical events, in the contingency of human events, to prove or demonstrate freedom. The freedom of the people in which we call the creation of its history. The burden of proof here, the onus probandi, would thus be incumbent on the freedomists. Yet the appearances speak in favor of the efficacy of human action and of individual action. History shows us that we would be mistaken if we trusted the appearances. It shows us that it was possible to push back or deflect the currents that seemed the hardest to resist. At every time there was a certain number. There doesn't have to be a lot of them, a certain number of energetic wills convinced of their rights. That's what history demonstrates. As soon as the appearance is there, it falls to those who deny the reality of the appearance to provide a counterproof. Now, they try to give us these proofs. In the Saturday course, we'll be able to discuss the proofs in relation to Herbert Spencer. They generally are a lot more metaphysical than they seem. At the bottom of the apparently scientific arguments, there's a metaphysics, and a very old metaphysics at that, a latent metaphysics. How are we to explain the fact, though, that we are so ready to accept theories like this? It's because science demands a kind of determinism, and if there isn't some kind of determinism in the course of history, then history isn't a science. Obviously, we have to accept determinism to some extent, but in the end, we shouldn't accept it so easily if our souls had no incentive, to welcome this belief. And even the feeling that are at the origin of the ancient belief in individual destiny, the same feeling comes together here, namely, first of all, a certain indolence. We must prefer believing that things will happen by fate, like they must happen. Then there's also pride, because it pains us to admit that a people of which we are a part, that a people is something accidental, or at least that the course of the evolution of this people is something absolutely accidental and contingent. We prefer to see it as something whose place is absolutely marked out in nature, something that's an ineluctable as the orbit of the planet tracing in space. In our own eyes, that raises us up. That puts us at a higher level. That's because it pains us to admit that contingency of the collective actions of humanity, for this contingency appears to us to introduce something accidental into them that diminishes and demeans them. That's why we welcome historical fatalism so easily. So the belief in fate belongs to all epochs. It belongs to ours as much as to the epoch of the ancient. It's been worthwhile to look at its intellectual and emotional origins. Now, gentlemen, we turn to the idea of necessity, such as we find it in the first phases of Greek thought, and such as we find it no longer in popular thought, but in the philosophers. As I was saying the other day, among the ancients, this idea is far from taking a precise and rigorous form it has in the moderns. When we speak of necessity, we immediately think of a natural law. And a natural law, a physical law, is something we define very easily and very precisely. It is a constant relation between variable magnitudes. Such a conception of physical law was possible only after the discoveries made in modernity. It presupposes the idea of varying simultaneously physical phenomena from the viewpoint of magnitude. This is not to say that the ancients didn't come into contact with this kind of experiments as far back as the most remote periods of classical antiquity. The Pythagoreans discovered the law that links the pitch of the sound to the length of the vibrating string. This law was indeed analogous to physical laws, such as we understand them. However, pitch for them was not a quantity, not a magnitude. They didn't manage to define pitch by the frequency of the vibrations. They didn't manage to generalize this idea. They didn't reach the idea of laws in general, such as we understand them, because, quite simply, their mathematics were not advanced enough. This isn't due at all, as some people say, to the ancients being incapable of observation and experimentation. It's simply because they didn't experiment with the aim of measuring, and because they didn't have the mathematical tools for measurement that we have at our disposal. And finally, because they hadn't managed to unearth what we call the idea of function, for that's what laws are. This idea could thus have existed in antiquity, and the very idea of necessity in the sense of reciprocal dependence in general, the reciprocal dependence of the parts of the universe in relation to one another. This idea, as I said, is hardly encountered except in the Stoics. We don't find the idea of universal reciprocal dependence of all phenomena, of all things of nature in relation to one another until Chrysippus. However, in these first attempts by Greek philosophy, we find an idea of necessity. This idea appears to be, above all, the idea of a determinate place marked out in advance for all facts of all cosmic events in time. The idea of the regularity of the course of nature is, in the ancients, strictly tied to the regularity of astronomical revolutions. The process is circular, like the revolution of the heavens. And at the end of a certain number of years, after thousands of years, things are back at exactly the same point in relation to one another. All of the parts of matter of the universe are at the same point in relation to one another. And then everything starts over again in the same way. The same events are reproduced in the same order, which is always circular. The idea is completely opposed to our modern idea of evolution. In contrast to the ancient idea, our modern idea of evolution, of progress, is the idea of an indefinite movement in a straight line. Their idea of evolution, and this idea subsists across antiquity, is the idea of a circular process and consequently of a limited progress and of a return of all things to the same place at the end of a determinate amount of time and of a universal starting over again. So we have what was among the first philosophers, as much as we can surmise from the small number of texts related to this question that have been handed down to us, the idea of universal necessity. We have some passages that sufficiently show that the ancients resolved the problem of freedom as we have posed in the direction of necessity. For example, we have two passages, very distant from the sources, unfortunately, on Heraclitus' philosophy, one from Plutarch and one from Johannes Stobaeus. I agree with these absolutely. This is what Plutarch says. Quote, Heraclitus says that all things are made by destiny. End quote. Stobaeus tells us that, quote, Heraclitus has shown that the essence of fate is reason circulating throughout time. End quote. I should note parenthetically that it's not certain that it's reason or logos. It's very possible that Stobaeus attributes a Stoic view to Heraclitus. Quote, the logos is the ethereal cause. End quote. The famous ether, the, quote, many of universal becoming, the measure of fixed periods, end quote. Periodos is a cyclical course of things. He adds, according to Heraclitus, everything comes about by destiny. As much as we can judge from these fragments, this shows that, according to Heraclitus, there is a universal regularity, a universal necessity. And in all likelihood, humans are caught in the gears of all things. However, this is not said explicitly. There's also one of Democritus' claims that has come down to us. However, Democritus represents a philosophical tendency quite different from that of Heraclitus. Quote, all things happen by virtue of necessity. Necessity is the same thing as destiny. End quote. Thus, gentlemen, at the beginning, the idea of universal necessity dominates. It would be an exaggeration to say that we're dealing with fatalist or deterministic theories here, since the fatalist solution is born only once we have posed the problem of freedom. When the problem is not yet even posed, we cannot find any solution for it. But what we must say is that there is explicitly contained in this first philosophy the belief in universal necessity, which, undoubtedly, it would have been quite difficult for those first thinkers to reconcile with the belief in freedom had they had been led to pose the problem. But the problem isn't posed until the day when the idea comes to slice very small circles out of the immense network of the events that compose reality, very small regions to which we then attach a privileged importance. I mean, human actions. From the day the idea came to isolate human actions, the necessity arises as well to wonder whether or not human actions must be lumped in with the rest of events, with the changes produced by nature. From that day, the problem was posed. It is Socrates. What I'm saying here is a banal truth. It's Socrates who took up human events, who separated them out from all the other events, who said, we are going to concern ourselves with them. We are going to concern ourselves with human events, and those first of all, and those alone. Nature, that's the God's business. It's they who made nature, and it's up to them to take care of it. The impossibility of physics itself has been demonstrated by the contradictions that the Stoic philosophers have presented to us, and at which they have ended up. And even if physics were possible, it would be useless, since what must concern humans are human things. Humans must be concerned with human things, and consequently, human things, human events, must be separated out from all the rest of reality and must be considered by themselves. Socrates adds that the inward gaze of consciousness must be turned towards human things. Certainly, this formula doesn't mean that we must do psychology, that we must analyze ourselves. Socrates gives the formula a much more practical and down-to-earth sense. Know thyself means look for what you can do. Be aware of what you can do, of what you know. Don't think you have what you don't know. Analyze yourself from the viewpoint of what you can do. Take stock of yourself. Weigh up your value. This, above all, is what Socrates meant, judging by the dialogue we find reported by Xenophon. However, it's possible that it was something more. It's hard not to see in Socrates something of what we call psychological analysis, and especially not to consider that he attributed the highest importance to inner observation. It's very hard when we think of the importance he attributed to the daimon, or rather to demonic signs, to this inner law that we probably shouldn't compare to the law of the mystics. Yet, which, from a certain angle, is already a mystical phenomenon. Certainly, this inner law does not teach him at all about the things beyond, about mystical things. It intervenes only in order to advise, and especially to warn against certain things. Nevertheless, it's true that the entire Platonic or Neoplatonic philosophy comes from this Socratic idea of the daimon. The concept of the daimon, in general, is thus indeed a concept with a mystical nature. Without attributing to Socrates all that emerged from this idea, we can nevertheless say that what emerged from it at least indicates the direction in which the idea was leaning. In Socrates and Socratic philosophy, we find what I'd call external symptoms of a doctrine of freedom, since the theory of freedom, all in all, is always characterized, is always distinguished by means of these characteristics. It opposes human things to natural things in general, or at least it separates out human things from natural things in general. Then, in varying degrees, the idea of freedom is always a call to inner observation. It's not rare that a mystical element joins in. Then finally, it presents a characteristic that some people have exaggerated a lot in relation to the current doctrines of freedom, but that we see even more in the ancient conception of freedom. It's been said that the belief in freedom is necessarily the sign of a reaction against positive science. That is not true. One can certainly say that this belief limits positive science to some extent, but in no way is it a reactionary belief against science. Nevertheless, there's a tendency in freedomist philosophers to diminish science in the strict sense, the natural sciences. Well, no one can go further down this path than Socrates, since he declares that knowledge of nature is, first of all, useless, then impossible, and even sacrilegious. We thus have an external symptom of a belief in freedom, of a theory of freedom. You know that historians of philosophy agree that there is in Socrates' philosophy, implicitly at least, a certain conception of human activity, a well-defined conception even. Fouillé goes very far in this direction. In his very remarkable book on Socrates, he allows us to see in Socrates the creator, the founder of determinism, at least of a certain kind of determinism, psychological determinism. The symptoms, even external appearances, are contrary to the text, and yet the passages I invoke are ones from which we might, at a pinch, draw this conclusion. Must we draw it? We don't have the time today to resolve this question. We'll attempt to respond to it at the beginning of the next lecture, only at the beginning, since we'll have to move on to Plato's opinions on this point.